Hey everybody, what's up? It's David Ariev here again for Eyedesyn.com for part 2 of this epic digital nature tutorial. Yes, we are really going to be creating God rays this time for reals, and then we'll be jumping in and finishing up our scenes, putting in some custom LUTs, and looking at some other interesting examples. Let's do it! Finally, the moment you guys have been waiting for, let's look at the settings to create God rays. So I've got two basic forest or trees sitting here, and I didn't even bother putting the leaves on them because I think this stripped down scene helps clarify the settings and allows us to work a lot faster. So let's just drop in a daylight, and I'm going to rotate it until it's backlighting our scene here, until we can actually see the sun. There we go. So this backlight will really bring out the rays because it'll be casting light into these branches, which will then create shadows in the volume directly into the camera. That being said, the next obvious thing to add in is the volumetrics. So let's click on our daylight here, come to the daylight tag, and then scroll down to the medium tab and just hit add fog. So let's crank the thickness a bit until the light decreases. This is going to depend a lot on our scene scale, so we'll play with this value a little bit later. Let's jump in here, and here we've got the density, the volume step length, the absorption and scattering. Volume step length doesn't do anything when we're in this environment medium, but it does when we're using an actual fog volume, and I'll show you that later. So let's start by adding a float texture in here instead of the RGB spectrum, just because it's easier to control. So let's go to C40 Octane float texture, and let's bump this one up to 1 so that we're getting full scattering, and let's bring down the density until we start to see something. Alright, so the most important control here for getting those God rays is this phase, and we want to bump this all the way up to something like 0.9, and you can see that totally boosts the intensity of the light. What's happening is when it's down towards 0, the light is scattering evenly, but the more we bring this up, the more the light is scattered in the direction of the light source, so it kind of makes the rays a little more parallel. So you can just start to see something happening here, but it's not very defined yet. Let's jump up a level here and go to our medium tab. And we just want to mess with the thickness until we start to see it get a little more defined. If we go this way, we're going to start to lose the effect. So let's bring it this way. And now we're seeing it a little bit more strongly. Let's keep going. And now we're really starting to see these form. The last control that's going to make a huge difference is this sun size. So just for comparison, say I brought this up to like 5. And then I'll store render buffer. And now I'll bring it back down all the way, this time to 0.1, which is the lowest it'll go. And you can see the smaller the light source, the more these shadows sharpen up. And finally, let's tweak the thickness one more time. I think around 20 we're getting even stronger results. And then if we move the camera down, you'll see this really become apparent. And one more thing, if I jump into the scattering medium and boost the density, you'll see this gets crazy strong. Cool, so let's take a look at doing the same thing with an area light. So what I can do is I can actually just come in here to the sky color and take this all the way down to black. Same thing with the sun color. So we've lost the sunlight, but now we're keeping all the same fog settings. And then let's just drop in an area light and bring this up and rotate it 180. And then let's set it behind the trees a little bit. And let's kind of pull our camera in here. Now the reason we're not seeing anything is because this is actually a very large light source. In order to catch those rays, we need the light source to be really, really small. So first let's just change this into more of a point light so it's casting in all directions. We can come over to details and change the area shape to sphere. And now let's just scale this down. And you'll see that we lose light because that's physically accurate. The smaller your light source, the less light it can emit. So we're just going to come in here and boost this like crazy. And now we're starting to see those rays. So let's just crank this all the way up. And that's the highest it can go. But again, the smaller the light source, the sharper these shadows are going to get. So let's store our render buffer here. And then let's make this light even smaller. And now to boost it even further and bring up the exposure, we can add a float texture into these texture and distribution slots. So we'll go C40 Octane float texture. And now let's just crank this super high. And then let's keep scaling down the light until we get to a similar exposure value. And if we compare these, you can see before these were much softer shadows. Same thing goes with the ground. If we take a look at this, and we'll compare this. And then I'll scale the light back up and reduce its power by removing this float texture. So I'll keep scaling it up. When we have softer shadows in the volumetrics, we also have softer shadows on the ground. Alright, so jumping back to the super small light source, it looks pretty weird right now because we can't even see the trees, we're just seeing the rays. And that's because we don't have any kind of fill light on the trees. So we can do that if we drop in a second light source. And this will actually be good to show a little quirk about Octane here. So let's navigate around and let's boost the power of this light source as well. So now we're seeing the trees, but we're also getting a ton of fireflies. And the reason is that this light source is so much bigger than this one. And the rule of thumb is that with smaller light sources, you want to give them more light samples. So if I jump into the small light here and go into the sample rate here and start to give this higher values, we'll see things start to even out. At some point, if we go too far, we see that this area light now becomes the one with a ton of noise. So it's a balancing act, and typically the closer you get to the source, the noisier the pixels will become. So with volumetrics, a lot of the time it helps to just hide the lights off camera. So I'll bring this off camera. And in this case, this one actually appears noisier, so we can probably distribute this a little bit differently and maybe boost the samples to like 3,000 here. When I go up to 11,000 here, I think it cleans up a bit more overall. So just a quick aside, because this process is really important for optimizing scenes. Finally, let's take a look at what happens if we use the fog volume rather than this environment fog. The environment fog is a bit more of a cheat. So if we go under Objects, Fog Volume, we get the fog volume box. And I'm just going to go to my daylight and go to the medium tab and clear this out. So let's scale up our box here. And you want to be careful while doing this because you might crash your computer. So I'm going to take the voxels up so it's a lot lighter. And I'll just keep scaling this to somewhere around here where it encompasses our vision. So the cool thing about the fog volume is that because it's in a box, you can isolate it to just certain areas within your scene. For instance, if you want fog just at the top of your trees or just at the top of some mountains, you can do that. Or maybe a layer just above the grass, for instance. So let's jump in here. And let's take the density way down until we start seeing our trees. And now let's open up the absorption and scattering. And let's do a similar thing with the phase where we just bring it right up to 0.9 or so. Let's take our scattering up to 1. Cool, so we're getting our volumetric light back, but it's taking a lot longer to render. So it's a trade-off. I think that this scenario is a bit more physically accurate versus the environment fog, which is more of a cheat. But you have to consider the trade-off of render time. Okay, another quick aside. If you ever wondered what this surface brightness tick box is, if you turn this off, then you're uncoupling the scale from the brightness. So if I remove this texture here and bring the power back down to something a little more reasonable, what it means is I can scale this light as big or as small as I want, and it won't ever change the intensity of the light. So at some point you're starting to see the actual source, and you can see that it doesn't alter the brightness. Now this is less physically accurate, so in general I like to keep surface brightness on, but it's just another good way to get to that result where if you want to scale it down and not have to mess with the brightness a ton, you can easily get those rays. Okay, and another way to get a cool look, if I turn off this light here and go to Options and untick Check Camera, this means we can navigate around without affecting our hero view. So I'm going to turn off this volume, but just in the viewport so I can see what I'm doing. And I found that when I move this light right into the trees, it was creating a pretty interesting look. So let's stick with that for the time being while we experiment with the volume object. I'll jump back into this camera and then go to Check Camera again. And I'll turn back on the volume so that we can see the voxels in the viewport. So I'll jump into the Generate tab and then I'll put a noise in the texture. I'm going to drop in just a standard C4D noise. I'll jump into the noise and then I'll select my favorite electric noise for creating some cloudy looks. And now in order to see what's going on, we definitely have to decrease the voxel size. So let's set this to like 155 for now. And we'll jump back into the noise and increase the low clip slider so that we're crunching the noise down. I'll boost the octaves as well. And then let's just increase the global scale by a lot. Now let's bring in some more density so we can actually see these clouds. And let's turn this other light back on so we can see the form of these things a bit better. And maybe we'll duplicate it across as well so that we get even more. Okay, right now there are some really big dead zones, so I'm thinking I'll take down the size a bit more. Let's try 2500. That's looking a lot more interesting, but now I want to give it some more detail. And to do that, I'm going to have to go to this voxel size here and decrease this, but if I go too far, it's going to crash. So one way I can avoid that is if I actually make my volumes smaller, since we're just dealing with a smaller scene here. So let's just scale this down. And this is going to clip the volume. So you can see the volume stays the same, but as we scale this down, it's clipping off the box. So maybe we only want this much in terms of the fog. Now, so we don't get hard lines here, I'm going to increase the edge feather all the way up. And that's just going to prevent us ever seeing the clipping of the volume against the sides of the box. And now if I jump back in here, I can probably reduce the low clip so it's a bit more even on the whole. And if we jump back here into our medium, yet again, we can mess with the scattering phase, and this will actually allow us to preview the shape of the volume a lot better because it scatters more evenly. So let's store render buffer on this, and then go back to our voxels and decrease this all the way down to like 15. Be careful doing this though, because this could easily crash your computer. So now we're getting a lot more detail. Okay, now I'm feeling like this is actually too small, so let's go back to like 5000, and I think that gives us a bit more interesting variation in scale. So now if I turn off those other lights I added in, it'll look a lot more dramatic. Maybe we need to bring back a bit of fill here. So I'll just bring this one down. And jumping back into the volume, I can mess with some funky colors in here in both the absorption and scattering. And then this light can come down even further. Back into the volume, we can also mess with the density, but that's going to bury the trees. But also define the outline of these volumetrics in a really interesting way. So imagine pushing through this could be really cool. And remember that we can bring the scattering phase further up if we want to punch this light through the volumetrics even more. But the trade-off there is that we're going to darken all of this stuff. So in that case, we would want to bring back some fill light with these other lights. Also, if you ever want to see this refine a lot faster, you can just grab your render region here and just have it preview this section. And if you wanted a different look, you could also mess with the volume step length. This is kind of like feathering, so the lower we bring this, the more we're going to see these defined edges. But for this, I'm going to go back to what we had before. Now weirdly, the noise type electric doesn't have a seed, so if you want to see different looks really quick, you can just mess with the animation speed parameter. So if I crank this up, I'll get some different looks. And lastly, if I want to get even more detail in this, rather than decreasing the voxel size even further and risking crashing the scene, I can use this voxel multiplier here, which will actually allow us to add more detail once the image goes to the picture viewer, and I'll show you what I mean. Okay, and it actually added the leaves back in because the render levels were set to 6, so this is actually a prettier result than I was anticipating. But testing the voxel multiplier in this instance didn't do a whole lot because the volumetrics are not very dense. So if we go back here, you can see that I upped them to a much higher density and a much lower volume step length. And I don't like this look better, but it'll at least let you see what I'm talking about. So let's boost this a bit in the filter so that we can see what's going on. And for instance, in here you can see this really adds a lot more detail when I boost the multiplier. So this is actually a difference between 1 and 5 for this setting, but the number that works for you will totally depend on your scene, and you're going to have to do some trial and error. Alright, so before we jump into the main scene, I wanted to make a correction from last week, and thanks to my buddy Renderhead for this tip. So we've just got a multiflora sitting here, and if you remember, it's not a big deal if we just click through the library and try out different plant species. But the area we get into trouble is when we were removing unused materials. So say we grab all of these and go to materials, convert materials, and materials, remove unused materials. Now when we were to jump back and try to add in a flower, we get all of these missing textures. And last week I recommended jumping into a new scene, but there are some helpful tick boxes here that I didn't know about. So if we just click on insert new materials, we can then click on reset materials and it'll remove all of them. And from there we can then go and add our flower or whatever it is, and it'll be fine. but make sure both of these boxes are ticked. Alright, here we are back in our scene. The only difference is that I've changed the camera angle and lighting a little bit from last week. And we want to finally add in the trees. So let's drop in a new scatter object here. And I think I only want like 100 trees because this is not the biggest scene ever. So I think 100 is going to be enough. And then let's switch to surface and I'll pick one tree to start with. Let's try, I was having some good luck with this Morton tree earlier. So let's drop this in and turn this on. And of course we have to tell it what to scatter onto, so let's grab the landscape and drop that in there. Okay, and our vision is now filled with some tree all up in our grill, so let's scooch back here and see what's going on. So there's all of our trees, but they feel a little bit condensed downwards, like we can't see the landscape anymore. So one thing that I like to do is just jump into the tree, and we can go to the trunk parameters, and then we can come down to trunk height and boost this up a ton. There we go, we've got much taller trees now, so let's jump back to our previous view. And let's boost these trees even higher. There we go, and that should get all the leaves out of the way. Well, let's scooch this up so we can see a little bit better. Okay, so the first thing that should be pretty obvious about this scene that's really wonky is these trees are growing diagonally out of the ground, which doesn't happen much in reality. So we can just go in here to this Octane scatter and super easy change the normal align to 0. Alright, so that's looking pretty cool. Maybe we do want to introduce a little bit of that variation, so we can maybe blend it back in so that they're not all perfectly straight up. So there we go, maybe that's a little bit more interesting. Okay, at this point we also need to add in our random effector, so let's go to MoGraph effector random, and let's put this down here and apply it, and untick position, turn on rotation, and let's do 360. Let's rotate our daylight around so we get a little bit more light coming into this scene. And after a bit of tweaking, I found this position that I liked. And this is where things start to get really fun and creative, because we've just created this whole world that you can fly around in and pretend you're a photographer, find compositions that you like, and for the most part it's procedurally created. So it's pretty bizarre still to me that this is all possible. So say I come down here and I like this composition, I can do my favorite little trick with my bokeh and go to my thin lens and start cranking up the aperture, change my aperture aspect to 2 and the edge to 3, so I get more of an anamorphic bokeh look. And suddenly we have this really pretty nature picture that looks fairly convincing. I'm going to jump back to our camera angle we were using a second ago, and let's play around with adding the rest of these trees in here and see what happens. And again, we landed in the middle of the tree, so let's navigate out of here. So again, this is looking a lot more dense, so maybe we could just copy the tree height for most of these that we did with this Morton tree. So let's go to trunk parameters, select the trunk height, copy that, and then paste it into the rest of them. Okay, that helped, but maybe let's try getting rid of some of these bigger trees that are blocking out all the light. So let's get rid of the beech tree, the cork tree, and the oak. Okay, that's definitely more like what I'm looking for. Let's jump back to our original camera angle. And there are like maybe some weird distortions from lengthening these trees out. For whatever reason, the Morton tree I think responded better to that. So I'm just going to go back to the simplicity of that single tree in this case. But in a little bit after we do the God rays, I'll show you a scene where I've used a bunch of different trees for bigger aerial shots. Cool, there we go. Let's play around with adding in a sky. So I'm just going to get rid of the trees real quick so we can focus on the sky. Alright, so I'm going to go to Objects, HDRI Environment, and then I'm going to jump into this image texture and navigate to an HDRI that I like. Okay, I like these VisPark sky domes. And they come in extremely bright, so I'm going to reduce the power a ton. Cool, and then I'll hit UV transform so I can scale it around. I'm going to scale it down quite a bit so that we get a lot more detail. And then I'll jump up one and rotate it downwards. And keep in mind, this is only going to work if you have mixed sky texture on your sun. Without it, you're only going to see the background from the sunlight. Let's turn our trees back on, and let's boost the power of this a bit so it's a little more subtle, and so we're not getting such dark shadows. And if we want to further affect the HDRI, like maybe shift the hues or desaturate, we can just add a color correction here. But there's a bit of a gotcha to keep in mind that it shifts the position of the HDRI. So we're just going to have to realign it. Let's turn back off the trees. And if you look now, these controls don't work anymore because we've added a second node in here. So let's jump into the color correction and deal with this first. I think I want to shift the hue a little bit. If we go this way, it becomes more cyan. I think I just want to desaturate a bit and maybe shift the hue slightly to pull it a little bit away from purple. Okay, now if we jump into this image texture, we can then bring this back down. Let's pop the trees back on, and let's scooch this around and see if we can get a nicer background. Okay, I think I took the saturation down a little too much, so let's split the difference. Alright, so this is looking really cool, but let's finally use what we learned about God rays to totally change the mood of the scene. So I'm going to rotate the sun around until we're backlighting the scene. There we go, and now let's go into this north offset and play with this for a bit. Okay, I think this is getting close, but let's lift up the sun a bit. Let's keep rotating it until we actually see the sun. I think this is getting close. You can tell because the shadows are coming towards us. Let's go to our coordinate and just drop this down even further. Okay, this would be a whole lot easier if we lost the trees again. I should have done that earlier. And of course, the sun is just right there. So let's pop the trees back on and then rotate the sun just a bit more until it's kind of coming through the leaves so we know we're going to get some of those shadows. So there, the sun is blasting us, so let's just go a little bit up until it's covered. So I think right about there is going to be good. All right, let's drop in our fog. And then before we mess with the thickness, let's jump into the scattering medium and take the scattering all the way up to 1. And maybe the absorption around 0.5. Though it's easier with a float texture. So there we go. The absorption just controls how much light is soaked up by the volumetrics. So if you go for a higher number closer to 1, you're going to get a lot more light in the scene. But it's not going to affect the distance that you can see into the scene, unlike scattering, which will. Let's go back to 0.5. And let's pull down the density. So there we can already see, even without changing the phase, we're getting some of these rays, which is pretty cool. Now keep in mind, our daylight is also at a sun size of 0.1. If this were higher, these rays would get a lot more diffuse. Let's go back to 0.1, jump back into our scattering medium, and let's take the phase right up to 0.9. Okay, we're getting somewhere, but obviously it's way too much right now. So let's mess with the thickness to see if we can dial this back. Let's jump up. Okay, this is an interesting look. It's a little more graphical and silhouette-y. Pretty cool, but I don't think it's what we want. Let's take the thickness lower, but increase the density. And this is cool, but maybe we could rotate the daylight a little bit downwards so that we don't necessarily see it directly. Okay, now we've got these pretty intense light rays beaming through the trees. I like this look better, but it's still really, really strong. Okay, I just took the thickness up to 265, and this gave us more of a super foggy day. And taking the phase back closer to 0 will basically scatter the light a lot more and produce more of a general fog. So I never thought I'd say it, but these God rays are over the top, and I want to take them way back. So the main controls for that would just be the phase. So if we took the phase back down to 0, these will get a lot more subtle. And to me, that's already looking a lot more natural. We can also reduce the density. And I think that's looking a lot more subtle and nice. If you want to define these a bit more, again, you can just bring the phase up a little bit. So that's definitely more defined and pretty, but not horribly over the top. So I loaded up this scene into the newest version of Octane, which is 3.08 RC2, and this is available to subscription users. And for the rest of this tutorial, I was using 3.07, but I did this because I wanted to show this new feature with custom LUTs. But first I noticed that the settings don't look the same at all. So if you're following along with me, you might be having trouble if you're using this version. So I want to just show a couple things that I would do to get the scene back to where we had it. So it looks like Amit has changed the thickness to medium radius, and that's just a difference in the name, but it does the same thing. So in this case, I found that if I crank this up to around 2000, we'd start to bring those strong God rays back in. So the software is always changing, and these values will change with it. So it's more important to learn the techniques behind what I'm doing rather than the values that I'm using. And it's always going to take some trial and error and dialing values against each other with any scene to get to the point where you like it. Now, one more thing, I'm going to lose the God rays and turn this sunlight back on, so it's going to override the previous one. And this is one last thing I wanted to show about HDRIs. In our scene right now, we've got some pretty deep shadows that I'd like to lighten up. Now, if we went to our daylight and we turned off mixed sky texture, you'll notice that the shadows get a lot lighter, but then we lose the backplate, which is not what we want. But maybe there's a way we can get the best of both worlds. So let's turn this back on. And now if we come to this environment tag, we can change the type of the environment from primary to visible. And by default, that's only going to appear as a backplate. And you can see we've now got much lighter shadows that are dependent on the daylight instead. Now if we want to control this even further, we can duplicate our HDRI one more time. And this one we can set from visible to primary. And now we're kind of back where we were. But here we can jump in and change the gamma a lot. And you can see this is affecting the shadows. So if we bring this way down, we could really add a lot of fill light in. And all the while we still have independent control of the backplate, so we could come in here and we could desaturate it and we could expose it up and down. But here you have to be careful because you can easily break reality and create something that looks pretty weird where the background is not well illuminated but the foreground is. So even the way we have it right now, the rocks are clipping but the background isn't. So that's not very realistic. So what if we boosted this background to 2 and now we're clipping but things seem to be more in the same range, and then we could come to our camera imager and bring down the overall exposure. And this feels a lot nicer to me in terms of the exposure from what we had before. The shadows aren't too crazy deep and the highlights aren't blowing out either. Okay, here's the new setting I want to talk about. It's called Custom LUT, and what that stands for is Lookup Table. It basically means just a color grade. It's a way of transforming colors from one set of colors into another to get a different look. So think like Magic Bullet looks, but it's all integrated into Octane, which can help you make decisions in render rather than in comp. So from my color grading days, this is one of my favorite LUT packs. It's called Osiris. It's vision-color.com. And if we look at all products, you can see they're not too expensive. And this is what I'm going to be using. So I can navigate to this custom field here and navigate to my Osiris pack. And rather than installers, I'm just going to jump into my LUTs. And we've got versions of these LUTs that are both log and Rec 709. So the log LUTs are meant to be applied to much flatter footage, and the Rec 709 LUTs are meant to be applied to footage that already look pretty contrasty and normal. So that's what we've got here, so we'll use the Rec 709. Okay, and my favorites that I want to highlight are KDX and Vision X. So I'm going to start with KDX. And so this is pretty interesting already. You can see how much this is shifting colors and making a dramatic difference. And all the while, when we're navigating in Octane, we can be viewing through this LUT, which is pretty cool. This one I like in particular because it kind of has an orange and cyan vibe, but it creates really strong primary colors and shifts blues a little bit more towards cyan and greens a little bit more towards this yellowy orange color. You can see these strong oranges. So if we compare this and then take down the strength, this is really cool that we have this strength slider so we can blend it back. So let's go all the way back to what we had. This is the pretty big difference that it's making. But The reason I like these LUTs is because they're pretty subtle. They're not like wrecking the colors like you'd expect from something like Magic Bullet. They're just constraining the color palette. Okay, let's bring this back up. And if we feel like this is a bit too yellowy green, we can just shift this a little bit more this way and maybe boost this a bit. And now maybe it's getting a bit magenta, so let's bring it back a touch, but maybe shift it even higher. That's looking pretty okay to me. If we enable our A/B comparison, you can see what I mean. We've gone from pretty green to a little bit magenta, so maybe we could bring it a little bit the other way still. There we go. I think I like this better. And now the other thing to take a look at is we've got this drop down called order for response, gamma, and LUT. So what this means is the response curve is happening first as the first grade, then the gamma is applied next, and then the LUT is applied after that. So if we shift the order of these things, it's going to dramatically change the image. So typically I'd say stick with the default, but if you know what you're doing, you can change this around. It's just like having a layer stack of color grades in After Effects where the order matters because you're processing it in one way and then you're processing additional color tweaks on top of that. Okay, let's try out one more LUT. Let's go to this Vision X. And this one's a little more stylistic. It puts a lot of blues in the blacks and shifts the highlights a little bit yellow, but it's kind of neat looking. Maybe let's give this a half cut. And maybe let's shift it away from magenta. That's looking a lot better. So maybe now we can crank it back up. So let's compare this to it without. And you can see the color difference that's making. I've been waiting a long time for custom LUTs in Octane, and it's really cool to have them because I used to do a lot of color grading work, and I've got some favorites to pick from. This one's got a very sepia tone. Kind of interesting. And this one really hits the orange and cyan thing hard to the point where it's really ugly. So I would definitely dial this one back. And if things are flattening out too much, you can always play with the gamma and exposure and try to correct against it until you end up with something a bit more interesting. Cool, so now that you know the majority of the techniques that I use, I just want to show you through a couple scenes and give you a bit of a breakdown. So this is a larger scale scene, and it doesn't necessarily have more instances. Like if we take a look at this scatter for the grass, there's only just above 1 million instances. They're just larger and a bit clumpier, but from a distance it works. And here with the trees, I've got a bunch of different types in there, so we get a lot of variation. And I've got 15,000 instead of just 100 like we used in the last scene, because this is meant to be a much larger scale scene and it's covering a much larger distance. Then for the distribution, I've got a layer shader with a couple noises overlaid over top of each other to create large patches in the trees so they're not all uniform. And the same thing goes with the scale. I've piped in a noise into the scale so that we get a bunch of variation in terms of the scale of the trees. And in this case, the God rays are created by this volume object rather than an environment fog. So if we jump in here, nothing too interesting going on. I've got white in both the absorption and scattering, and the scattering phase is set to 0 in this case. And as for the volume box itself, if I zoom out here, you can see that it totally covers the whole landscape, but not really the sky, so that with an aerial view, we can see a bit more clarity peeking up over this haze. Also, in this case, the voxels are set to 1000, because we're not actually looking for any detail here, and we're not creating any clouds or patches. And it's always kind of astounding once you've built out a world like this that you can just fly the camera through it and try to find interesting compositions and places to seat the camera, basically in order to take pretty pictures all inside your computer. It's pretty freaking weird. Okay, and if I turn off both of the scatter objects and this volume, you'll see the secret to my large scene. It's that the geometry is extremely simple. It's just a plane with a displacer. So the plane's got 255 segments in width and height, and then in the displacer, I just set it to the basic noise type, and I've got the scale super high, so we've got these rolling hills. So if we wanted, we could make these hills even more extreme and turn all the scatter and volumetric stuff back on. And now we've got the tops of these little hills poking up through our volumetrics. And there we go, we've got a totally different look going on. So these are some scenes I've been experimenting with lately, and I'll run you through it here in a bit. And you'll see that in this tutorial, you've learned everything you need to know to create these scenes. So even these lanterns are utilizing all the same techniques we just learned. For instance, the ground is just a couple real displacement textures. There's a volume object covering the scene, this time with voxel size 500. White colors in both the absorption and scattering. And if we pan up here and keep going, we can see that there's a sunlight pretending to be a moonlight up here. So if we look at the sunlight, you can see that I stripped out the color from the sky color and sun color, and then in the camera imager I've got the white point set to very orange. And without that, the sun and the rest of the scene wouldn't have that blue cast. So I like seeing that blue and then the warm orange from the lanterns. And if I take off the volume, all that's back there is a single black color. Even the lanterns are using some techniques that we used before. So if I jump into this paper lantern and go to the node editor, I've piped this diffuse texture both into the diffuse slot and the transmission. So if I were to remove these nodes, let's just get rid of the bump there, and then take the transmission back down to 0 where it was originally, you'll see that light is no longer allowed to pass through. Then the second we pipe this into the transmission, that allows the lights that I've got sitting in these lanterns to shine through them. And again, these are just spherical area lights. Alright, well that's about it for now, but let me know in the comments what other ideas you've got for tutorials. I've got some myself, like light tunnels, underwater scenes, snowy scenes, some space/Mars stuff. The list goes on. I'm going to be doing these tutorials forever. So you just let me know and we'll do it for you. See you later.